And we are ready to go. So a very warm welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for participating to this University of Portsmouth interdisciplinary webinar. We're doing this now for 6 weeks. I'm very happy to chair and discuss with you for the past 6 weeks. We have a number of exciting meetings to come. Today, I'm very, very happy to welcome our speakers. They are best specialists in the field worldwide. We have people coming from India, the US, UK, and all over the world, really. So we have 4 excellent speakers today. We have Gavin McGillivray, who's the head of DFID India, Jennifer Colley-Wilson, who's the Chief Impact Officer of Trademark East Africa, who's normally based in Nairobi, but joining us from the US today, Palu Modi from the UK, who's a development consultant specialist for many years, a variety of issues worldwide. Professor Tamsin Bradley, who's one of our professor of and a specialist area of development studies based in the UK, and myself. Before we start, I'd like to say a few words about development aid, because I know not everybody here is a specialist. So what are we going to talk about? Development aid, or also foreign aid, official development assistance. You use different names actually. This covers the development which is given by generally countries. The states represent by far the largest donors, really. We have different forms of development aid. It can be bilateral or multilateral. So bilateral from a country to another and to a number of recipients, or multilateral, naturally you think about major international organizations, UNDP, UNICEF, UNAIDS, etc. As I said, 80 to 85% of what we call development aid comes from government sources as official development assistance, ODA. Some of you are very familiar with this term. You also have private players, but they do not represent that much. Naturally, you heard about these big charities. The biggest one, I think, is Novo Nordisk, and then comes the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or you have the Inca Foundation or the Wellcome Trust, just to name a few. But again, these represent only 10–20% of really the money which is given as development aid. You may know as well that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has listed the donors and what they call Development Assistance Committee, the DAC. It consists of 34 largest aid donating countries in the world. The US first, and then the UK, interestingly, which is really a very big donor, Germany, and then Japan, France, Sweden, Norway, etc. So in this context today, we are going to try to understand what development aid is going to become post-COVID-19 crisis, because naturally, as the crisis is impacting all sorts of activities of governments, it's certainly going to impact aid. Hopefully positively, maybe we are going to be able to rethink aid all over the world and prioritize a number of sectors. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to our speakers. I'd like to start with Gavin, who's the head of DFID India. Gavin, could you maybe introduce yourself and introduce your work before you take the floor? I don't know, Gavin, I think your mic is muted still.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very much. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So I beg your pardon. Leila, thank you very much for bringing us all together. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, particularly hearing what others have to say. I'm speaking from New Delhi, where I head the UK aid agency, which is called the Department for International Development. And I've been living in Delhi for some 3 years. And India is one of DFID's smaller programs in the world now. I could talk more about DFID if that would be helpful, but I thought I might just say a few words about the topic that you've introduced, if you would like me to do that. So Leila, I think I've given myself an ambitious framework to think about it, which I will fail to fill. But I was just going to say a few words on 3 areas. One is some thoughts about how the world might change with the COVID crisis. One is how the development agencies might change, the development world. And thirdly, how the way we operate might change. And that's just a few thoughts on that last one. So just, and these are quite random thoughts. So how the world might change. And I suppose I'm quite influenced by what I see and what's happening in India, is we may well see the hand of the protectionists being strengthened. So those that oppose globalization, free trade, I think they will have arguments on their side that this is what happens when we open up to the rest of the world. We should be looking at self-sufficiency, and they will be emboldened. I think other voices will counter by saying, but this crisis perfectly illustrates the need for global collaboration. However, my judgment is that the voice of the more protectionist voices will be louder. I think we will see a reduced reliance on international supply chains, or in particular, just-in-time international supply chains. People will not want to be so reliant on single sources. I think I'm right in saying that India provides over a quarter of the pharmaceuticals sold in the UK. That is a tremendous reliance on one country. So I think we might see a diversification of international supply chains. The crisis has told us that environmental change, that we can stop climate change. I mean, it is extraordinary. In Delhi, we have the lowest pollution levels for several decades. I can breathe clean air for the first time in 3 years. So it's shown us that climate change is possible, but I have not heard senior politicians in anywhere, actually, not in India, not in the UK, not in the US, talking about this being an opportunity to do economic development in a different way. So I've heard the activists saying this is our opportunity, but thus far I haven't heard the politicians respond. So it seems to me like it's an opportunity that's going to be that is being missed. I think the world will have appreciated the value of research and development. I think we will see less resistance to investment in research and development. I think the world has seen the mistake of not investing in contingency planning. And I hope the world has seen the need for proper social protection measures. And just in India, it is quite horrifying the number of people that have been driven precipitately into poverty, not by the infection of coronavirus, which thus far is quite small in India, but by the lockdown. So those are just some thoughts about things that might change in the world. How things might change in the development world, the world of development assistance. First of all, there's always a big debate amongst donor countries like Germany, the US, the UK, of how much of our budget goes through the multilateral system, goes through the UN, the World Bank, the global funds, and how much we spend bilaterally, how much do we spend ourselves. And I think that debate will go on. And I think both voices will have been strengthened. Some voices will be saying, this shows that we need the multilaterals to join up. Again, however, my judgment is that those, I think probably those that say, actually, I mean, there's strong voices about using, in many countries, about development aid in mutual interests, so the interest of the recipient country and of the donor. And I think one will hear that more. I think we will hear the voices in the donor countries that are hostile to aid saying, why are we giving this money away? We have a crisis too. And then in many countries, I think aid budgets will be under pressure because there'll be such a lot of domestic spending happening. In the UK, our aid budget is a legal function of our gross national income. So unless that law changes, but however, we're likely to have an economic contraction in the UK economy this year, so the aid budget will automatically reduce. So I suppose my prediction is possibly a slight move away from multilateral towards bilaterals, except specifically with respect to infectious diseases and vaccination. So organizations like CEPI and Gavi might well benefit from this. Secondly, and these points follow on very much what I said before, I think we will see increased investment by the development agency in scenario scanning, in contingency planning, and in risk management. And we are all already starting this. So I think that will be a move. I think maybe we will see a move back into the health sector. I think the health sector had a wonderful first decade of the millennium with the establishment of the Global Fund, of the Global Alliance for Vaccines. Lots of us donors piled into health. I haven't got figures to hand, but I think probably there's been a bit of a move away from the social sectors and more into the economic development sectors, more into private sector development and infrastructure in the second decade of the millennium. I think now people are realizing that without good health, you can't have economic development at all. So we might just see health move back into health. And I think what we will see is more investment in data. One thing that I mean, India is probably amongst the most sophisticated developing countries with the most sophisticated data and statistics systems. But the truth of the matter is we really don't know what's happening. In real time, we have only the vaguest feeling for who is actually suffering, where are the vulnerable groups, which of the most vulnerable groups are receiving some assistance and which are being entirely neglected. So real-time data systems, I think we will see investment in those. And then just my last point, if I may, on the way we operate. I think we've all learned. I imagine you as well in the academia. We are learning how to use technology, and we have learned how to do meetings virtually much better than we were able to do two months ago, let's say. So I think we will see more use of technology in the way we operate. We probably see a bit less travel. People will be a bit less inclined to spend an awful lot of money on international travel. And I think we'll probably see the use of technology in program monitoring. At the moment, because we're all in lockdown, we can't go out in the field to see how our programs are doing. So we're having to rely on phone, on satellite, on technology. I think we'll be doing more of that. And many aid agencies have actually drawn down their people from developing countries back to their capitals. So most of DFID offices in Africa, people have been taken back home. So again, we are learning how to operate remotely, and we might see. I'm not talking about DFID in particular, but we might see some aid agencies realizing that the very expensive business of having expats in countries, in some cases, there'll be a higher bar against that. So those were just the thoughts I had, Leila. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gavin, for these very insightful first comments. Really fascinating. A lot of challenges, obviously. At the same time, some ray of hopes, really, because things might change for the better, at least to some extent. I'd like to give the floor to our colleague, Jennifer. Jennifer, you're heading as well a development organization, slightly different, obviously, trademark in East Africa. You're normally based in Nairobi. Could you kindly explain what you're doing and then also make a few remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Gavin, for opening. You all hear me okay? I was having
Jennifer, we don't hear you very well.
computer.
That's much better. Thank you.
Great. You can hear me now, okay? Great, okay. So anyway, a great scene set there. I'm Jennifer Collier-Wilson. I'm Chief Impact Officer at Trademark East Africa. We are a $500 million multi-donor facility. So we work with 10 donors, DFID included, DFID being our largest donor and our original founding donor. But now we're up to 10, which involves a lot of fun, I would say, in organizing how we report and work together. But I'll come to that model later because I think it has some implications here. So let me carry on then. I'll maybe pick up a little bit from what Gavin said and with some examples from our work in East Africa. So I think one thing that we've been looking at is what is different about this crisis from the normal development situation, or even from the normal type of crisis where you have a disaster that's located in one location or one region. There are certainly other sort of slow motion crises that donors are used to, but I think there's a couple key differences. One is just the massive economic impacts that are across donor countries and host countries alike. And I think Gavin alluded to this. You know, GDPs are going to be affected everywhere. So it's not just how are donors looking at economic recovery in the countries in which they work, but they're looking at the impact on the economy at home. And I completely agree with Gavin's statement that this really feeds into some protectionist feelings, some nationalistic feelings that were already out there. We've seen that over the last few years. And I think you can certainly see in the current events in the news that is happening. The other difference is this future of foreign aid funds being really affected by GDP considerations, where that's a legal requirement, as Gavin was describing in the UK, but just in terms of there's just not enough, the pot is not there to feed as many different foreign aid locations as donors may currently be doing. So how to distribute those resources is going to become a lot more scrutinized in a post-COVID environment. I think the second thing is what types of models and mechanisms really work for delivery in a system like that. So the need for donor coordination, I don't think we need to go there. You all know that's always critical, how not to overlap, how to provide the best that you can in the country where multiple donors are working and multiple organizations. But I think post-COVID will be different than coordinating in those immediate needs. And I'll give an example. In Kenya and in East Africa all over, actually, the youth unemployment crisis is already a slow-moving crisis that we've all seen coming for a long time. The demographics really tell the story. By 2050, the under 25 population in East Africa will double, and it's already very large, and unemployment is a big problem. So, of course, the question of the COVID economic impact and how that will affect those that already big problem and joblessness for young people. Or could we look at it as an opportunity, and especially when donors coordinate around particular programs, an opportunity to focus more particularly on the sectors that may be most important. For example, Gavin was talking about the reliance on international supply chains versus sort of more local manufacturing and more regional manufacturing. Africa is already trying to do this through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But the manufacturing is just really not there. Africa is not trading with itself very well, both because it's more expensive to do so internally than to send things to Europe. These are actual just facts about the way transport logistics work, but also because the manufacturing is not here. But if you're looking at training people, young people, for manufacturing jobs, when you're really trying to rely a little bit more close to home on regional value chains, and if donors will get together and focus on those sectors, I think it could really make a difference, even more so than it would have in a pre-COVID situation. Another key thing about models and mechanisms that work is we are a multi-donor model. Now, this makes it difficult, but we have a governance structure that has really allowed us to function, even though we have so many different donors, and hopefully not too much bureaucracy to slow things down. But we have seen in this immediate COVID environment that this multi-donor model has really been attractive to our government partners. The ministries know that we coordinate already, and so they've come to us to say, can you support our immediate needs, for example, for protective equipment, personal protective equipment at ports and borders. And so they see us as a neutral broker, in a way, of a lot of different donors, and that our pooled funds allows us to have more, potentially more available and be more effective because we have such a broad scope. We work in 8 countries currently, soon to be 10. And also at the regional level. So I think donors can be considering what types of implementation models will really work in a post-COVID environment for that kind of coordination. The third thing I would like to bring up is just the relationships with host country governments. And again, I think there are models that make that easier than others. All donor countries have relationships with the ministries and the government systems that they support, as well as the private sector. But in our case, it worked that for trademark, we were seen as a quick multi-donor solution. And even though health is not our scope at all. And so we have looked at, and our donors have supported us to do this, well, what other partners are on the ground that can support us delivering health equipment along the footprint that we already have at ports and borders and across transport corridors in order to keep trade actually moving in a very difficult environment. A fourth issue that I wanted to raise was about regional versus national. And I think there are a couple things to mention here. What are the strengths and weaknesses of regional approaches versus national ones? The virus obviously knows no borders, so if Uganda has been able to solve the problem, it will not be solved for Kenya and Rwanda necessarily. So that cooperation is sort of built in, and donors in this region already support regional organizations, the East African Community, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in the Horn, those kinds of organizations. But honestly, the capacity of those organizations is a question. And at a time like this, they will either rise up and meet the need and begin to coordinate regionally better, or they just won't. And I'd have to say at the moment, our concern is they may not quite have the capacity to meet the need. So donors will really have to consider, and I think Gavin alluded to this, where you make those investments. Do you make them at the national level and then try to coordinate all those different, which spreads things around a bit, and in an environment where monies may go down, that makes it more difficult? And then what's your balance in working through a regional approach and hoping that the capacity of regional organizations can deliver? And then the final issue is just the flexibility. What is the flexibility that donors have? There are all kinds of legal requirements around the way monies are spent. Our program was programmed to achieve 2 purposes: reduce trade barriers and increase business competitiveness. The results that we need right now don't match those. So what is the flexibility to change the scope of development programs? How quickly? And a key factor here is flexibility on the ground to get things moving and to change the scope, reallocate funds is much different than the flexibility in headquarters. And I'm sure Gavin can probably speak to that issue maybe a little bit more. So I'll close with that. I think there's a lot of time, I hope, for question and answer. So just to recap, I think there are sort of 5 things. What is different about this crisis? What types of models and mechanisms and creative thinking in that term should donors employ in the future? How best can donors support country governments? What are the strengths and weaknesses of regional versus bilateral or national approaches? And what kind of flexibility is there when you need to make evolving decisions? We don't know what the recovery trajectories are going to look like yet. Back to Gavin's point about the research that we need, the on-the-ground data, things are changing so quickly. So how do you then be flexible to change to that research that's coming out over time? Thank you very much. I will end there so that we can continue the conversation.
Super. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was really excellent. Absolutely fascinating. A new form of globalization is certainly possible, but it requires a lot of flexibility, as you said, more agile processes, and it's going to be slightly difficult to put in place rapidly. I'm sure you get lots of questions, and Gavin as well. People, prepare your question in the chat box. I will then read the questions to our speakers. But I'd like to give the floor now to Palu Modi. Palu, could you also kindly introduce yourself, tell what you're doing, and then make a few comments? Palu, are you here?
Sorry, I was on mute. Hi, talking to myself.
Great.
Hi, hi everyone. I'm Palu Modi. I've been working in international development for 20-something years. Started my career at DFID. I've worked for various management consulting firms, Crown Agents, IMC Worldwide, and Social Development Direct. Since January 2019, I've been working with the University of Portsmouth alongside a couple of other pieces of work, working for ICAI and working for a social enterprise in the US. I put together a few of my key thoughts, and so apologies to Gavin and to Jennifer for any repetition. I'll try and kind of go through them quite quickly, but I think we're all very much along the same lines. Coronavirus is going to have a very long-lasting effect on the global economy, on how we deal with pandemics, and also perhaps thinking about the architecture of international aid. Both Gavin and Jennifer have already talked about this, and there are different types of aid. We look at the project aid and the bilateral financing of global public goods, which is in many cases very beneficial, versus the traditional lending, which is sometimes harder to find the evidence of the longer term benefits. But I think we are going to need to, and the donors are going to very much have to think about where the priorities are. They are all under pressure and preoccupied with what coronavirus has done to individual economies, and I think the UK is no exception, but everyone's going to be feeling that pressure to reduce the money going into international development. So very much need to think about the global architecture of international aid, and what kind of revamp it has so that money is going to the right places. We know that 2/3 of the world's population live in developing countries and are facing unprecedented economic damage from the virus, as well as all of the issues and challenges that they already have. And in particular, fragile economies are going to struggle to minimize the spread of coronavirus while coping with the financial consequences of social distancing. It's going to be harder. Gavin's talked about India. Some countries are going to find that very hard to keep going and manage the social distancing. So as well as everything, all the other challenges, there are global challenges ahead on the environmental disasters side, biodiversity loss, etc. So all of that needs to be looked at. I read somewhere that SDG 13, the climate action, is likely to be one of the biggest losers out of this, because the focus is obviously going to be trying to make sure that we're still reducing the numbers of people in poverty and trying to reduce hunger. And Tamsin's going to talk more about inequalities and vulnerabilities, but certainly as a result of the pandemic, we are going to be deepening pre-existing inequalities in social, political and economic systems. I'm going to stop there, because otherwise I was going to really very much repeat what's already been said. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Palu. Again, fascinating and fantastic, because you raised a number of issues which had not been raised before. The SDGs and what are going to be the priorities, climate versus hunger. Well, we'll have to talk about that naturally. So Tamsin, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you. For those who don't don't know me, I'm a Professor of International Development at Portsmouth, but actually a social anthropologist by training, and I've worked on ending violence against women and girls for a couple of decades now, and that's involved really looking at what works to reduce the full spectrum of violence. The lens through which I am having this discussion, I think I hope the visibility is increasing in terms of the negative impact that COVID-19 is having, particularly on the most vulnerable and particularly on women and girls. And we can see that in the increases, or the surge even, in the number of domestic violence incidents, the number of women who are being killed in their homes, but also in the sort of global community of practices around harmful cultural practice. We can beginning to see increased reporting of increases in FGM. And this is really, really troubling and disturbing, because we're seeing these increases now in countries where we had actually seen reductions in prevalence, and reductions because of the concerted effort of the global movement and because of the commitment that donors have given ending violence. So we're in a position where a lot of the progress we will have made in terms of challenging and transforming the lives of the most vulnerable will have been reversed. So my major concern at this point is, when there is less money to be spent within the aid sector, that violence against women and girls as an issue will be reduced in its visibility. It has taken us a long, long time to get the kind of global acknowledgement that it represents a major challenge to gender, the achievement of gender equality. It's taken us decades to get to this point. So my concern is that there will be an unraveling of all of the knowledge, but also the commitment that we see. We're just at a tipping point, in terms of seeing real change in terms of reduction of prevalence. And by FGM, I just saw a comment pop up. I mean, female genital mutilation, for anybody that's aware of that term. So what is the background noise? I'm going to shut my window, apologies. Okay, so in terms of where I think, or how we might be able to respond better to violence against women and girls post-COVID, I think we really need to think about mainstreaming our aid programming. So what do I mean by mainstream? I mean taking a much more holistic lens. So rather than having a siloed approach in terms of an issue-based approach or a sector-based approach, we need to look, for example, at how we can mainstream FGM, violence against women and girls, across all of our programming, including energy programming, food security programming, livelihood programming. So it's about increasing our sensitivity to the fact that these issues will be playing themselves out in many different ways, and how can we use a development program as an inroad, not just to solve the problems that are the specific priority focus for that intervention, but also how can we also look at addressing other issues. And I think that can be done, but we really need to be driving this idea of mainstreaming, particularly around these issues of social justice. And again, this is work that is beginning, particularly in the kind of violence against women and girls space, but we have to keep driving it. And if there's less money, we need to use the money that we have even more effectively. And I think that will require us to take a different and perhaps in even more of a holistic lens to how we program, but also how we implement and how we build relationships, particularly at community level. I think it will be really difficult to do a lot of the kind of social norm change work remotely, because that does require interaction on the ground. And I think we can see rising levels in practices like FGM because organisations have had to pull back on that level of face-to-face, community level engagement and work. So again, we're thinking about how to do things differently, but there's an element of that relationship building and trust building that will be compromised if we aren't able to go back to something that looks like business as usual. And I'll end there. Time is going, and there'll be loads of questions.
Superb. Thank you so much, Tamsin. Again, I agree with you. Are very challenging times, and I think one of the solution, that's my personal opinion, but I think one of the solution could be to adopt not strictly a right-based approach to make sure that not only very micro questions but also very micro questions are addressed, and we certainly do need to go underground, maybe less or differently than before, but these face-to-face direct exchanges are very much needed. So I see that we have questions already, and I'm going to read the first one. Please do ask your question using the chat box. So the first question is from Tony Kirabira, who happens to be one of my PhD students who works on transitional justice. The question is the following: thanks for the excellent discussion. My question goes to Jennifer. How will the changing dynamics in development aid impact on the human rights related work and donor funded programs, especially in countries like Uganda, South Sudan, and Rwanda? I think it's a question for Jennifer, and I guess everyone, I'm sure Gavin would have something to say as well.
Okay, thank you, Lola. I'm sorry, I missed the first part as I was switching from headphone to speaker. Could you just repeat one more time?
Of course. The question goes to Jennifer. How will the changing dynamics in development aid impact on the human rights related work and donor funded programs, especially in countries like Uganda, South Sudan, and Rwanda?
Okay, thank you. Got it. The human rights was what I missed, and I think that was the critical piece. Thank you for that question. I have to say we are a trade-focused program, and so human rights is not our focus. But I think there's a couple of links to make there, and just sort of generally from the environment. And I think some of it Tamsin sort of brought up there. I know in Kenya, I've been following quite closely reports, and I think it's probably the same across East Africa, that lockdown situations have actually then stirred greater cases of sexual violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, people who are locked down with people who are not safe for them. And that's a huge concern. And I think it's something that I'm sure all the donors are looking at in terms of that kind of support. We as Trademark probably wouldn't get into that area, but where we would is we have a Women in Trade program. And for most of those cross-border traders, whether women or men, but particularly for the women, they are providing the food on the table for their family. And if they can't trade that day because of a lockdown or some other stoppage due to health and safety concerns, then there may not be food on the table that night. So again, that macro level issue of how are we protecting the most vulnerable was already raised. But I think from a human rights perspective, how are we going to look at ensuring that those vulnerable people are protected, and that those human rights considerations are being brought into trying to keep economies going. So I don't have enough human rights expertise maybe to answer in depth, so some others may be able to add, but I think that's a really excellent question, and it's definitely relevant.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Gavin, would you like to add up something on that, knowing that you do have a number of human rights related programs in India or in South Asia?
Thank you, Leila, and thank you, Tony. It's a really good question, and I'm afraid you've caused me to think about it, and my initial thoughts are not very encouraging from both the donor and the recipient or the partner country point of view. So in many developing countries, the nationals portray human rights agendas as being agendas imposed by foreigners. Why are you trying to impose your values on ours? We have our own culture, our own tradition, our own way of doing things. So that's a fairly standard argument in many developing countries. And I think we've already talked about how the COVID crisis is strengthening the hand of the nationalists. And I think that would in turn will strengthen any resistance which was already there to value-driven agendas coming from the outside. So I think we'll see more resistance from many developing countries. I think on the donor side, if budgets are under pressure and actually, I think both on the recipient and the partner country. So we've all talked, or most you have talked about the importance of jobs, about economic recovery. I think partner countries will be looking for help in that area, and donor countries will also be looking to rebuild trade, rebuild markets, rebuild health systems, put up barriers to stem the spread of infectious diseases from developing to developed countries. So I fear that human rights, resources for human rights will be under pressure from both ends, which I'm concerned about, but that's my initial thinking.
Yeah, and actually it's a very big concern. I'm glad we had the UN Secretary General eventually say, but he waited more than a month to say that it was a human rights crisis, because the right to health, to start with, is a human right. So these things should have been said earlier, and I'm afraid I agree with you. We might face a number of challenges to address these issues. I'm going to use my privileged right as a chair to ask everyone a question about regionalization. This is one of the solutions we put forward, but how do you see that happening? More regional cooperation, more donor recipient cooperation at the regional level?
Okay.
Yeah,
sure, Leila, thank you. Yeah, this is really relevant for us in our work every day. And I'll give an example. We had a Twitter conversation yesterday where we invited WTO, ISO to talk about standards. So we're talking about standards for food, for example, safety standards, sanitary, phytosanitary standards. And this is something we already work on, both in trying to strengthen the quality infrastructure in key supply chains in East Africa. So there are regional bodies that deal with that. They're trying to harmonize or create mutual recognition of standards so that goods can flow more easily between countries in a region. But then we also are trying to work on the business side of it with private sector, with traders and exporters, to ensure that they understand the standards, they have the ability to meet them, and overall just trying to bring the cost and time of those standards processes down, both to ensure safety but to increase exports. And so we talked about why is that so important in COVID. And I think everybody's concerned, people are worried. It's a zoonotic disease that we're working with here, meaning you really shouldn't, it's not transmitted through food directly, but people are afraid, and standards are going to be something that everyone wants to ensure is there. And I think that's where a regional approach is going to be really important. So how to keep the food supply chain working. East Africa actually has enough food to feed itself. But the concern is that they actually can't move it quickly enough because of things like regional standards not being harmonized. So I think that's a little bit of a technical issue, but a sort of practical example of where something like regional cooperation will be really important. The other thing that we have noticed in East Africa happening is we're encouraging regional integration, regional economic integration, so that trade can flow easier. But there are some disputes. Uganda, Rwanda have had trouble for a long time. Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda. I think COVID has actually allowed an excuse to put more stringent constraints on, oh, you can't bring your maize from Uganda into Kenya right now because we don't know about its safety. And really, those are just underlying trade issues that have nothing to do with COVID. So I think that's where there's some some regional approaches that, if supported appropriately, could really help in reducing that kind of use of a crisis like this, but then also make sure that trade is safe.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Someone else on regionalization? Not necessarily. Do you have more questions from the participants here? I see a number of people who are working on development-related issues, so don't be shy to ask your questions.
Leila, if you'd like me to say something on while people are thinking up questions on regional collaboration, I absolutely agree with everything Jennifer says, and there ought to be more impetus to regional collaboration to stem cross-border infection, to stem, to have better uniformity of standards on food and on medicines. And I think one thing we are already seeing in terms of collaboration between the richer and the less rich world is on vaccines. So much of the research capacity for identifying new vaccines is in the richer countries. It's in the US, it's in the UK. But the production capacity is significantly in the lower middle income developing countries. I think I'm right in saying that India produces about half the world's vaccines. It's a massive production capability here. So there's a clear need. The world is trying terribly hard to identify a vaccine that works against COVID. But at the same time, we need to build up the ability to manufacture very quickly hundreds of millions of doses of that as soon as it's ready. So already there are conversations between the research community and the production community. Just one slightly more tendentious point is that one might see models of regional, competitive regionalization. So countries seeking to bring together groups of countries in their image, or not in their image. So you might find in Asia, for example, that China seeking to form groups of countries and providing assistance to and be the regional leader, and you might find other countries seeking that leadership role. So there might be this sort of competitive regionalization, and I don't know, Jennifer, whether something similar might happen in Africa as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, absolutely fascinating, because we see from a geopolitical perspective, certainly some changes to come in terms of balance of power in particular. In this regard, I have a question which relates: how will the development aid organization avoid the politicization of COVID-19 strategies? I'm looking at the example of the US and WHO situation at the moment. I don't know who wants to pick up on this one. Okay, we have sorry.
The best defense is to have Claire Short as your development minister and to pass an International Development Act, which is what the United Kingdom did in 2002, an International Development Act which makes it illegal to use aid for political or commercial purposes. And I thank Claire Short and the government of that time almost on a daily basis, because there is certainly a tendency to politicize. I mean, there was since the beginning of aid, there's been a tendency to use it for political purposes. But we are very, very fortunate in the UK to have a legal barrier against that.
Jennifer?
Yeah, as an American citizen, I suppose, and a former USAID employee for quite a long time, I think I will not address that immediate issue. I think it is an unfortunate outcome this crisis being politicized. But I think that's, again, the issue that we're seeing, like I even saw in East Africa. Let's bring up old trade disputes and blame COVID to revive those. So, I mean, I think this is a kind of tool that sadly can be used in all kinds of political fronts. Thinking about regionalization and that sort of politicization, I think this is where we were looking at sort of, regional value chains. There's already been a move to create a diversity away from reliance on global supply chains. I think Gavin mentioned that in the beginning as well. So I think that's where there is a little bit of way to say, look, this isn't necessarily about politicization, and we don't want goods from China anymore that could be, that this kind of shock could affect us this badly, and this is what Africa is experiencing. That, focusing on having that diversity. Yes, globalization is still a good thing. We still need to be able to trade globally, but we need to diversify those supply chains. We need to trade with ourselves more as regions, as continents, and try to walk that middle line between this protectionism, self-reliance, the goal of self-sufficiency versus the benefits that global and regional trade can bring. And I guess there is a political angle to that, certainly, whether you work politically on a regional level or more on a bilateral basis. So very interesting questions. I don't think that really answers anything, but I think, as Gavin says, there are legal remedies that some countries have been able to take to avoid that, and some just don't have that. Unfortunately, the US does not.
Yeah, and actually, as a law professor, I'm more than happy to hear that. I'm always preaching for maybe light legal framework, but some sort of legal framework as we have in the UK, because, people are not charitable like that. They don't give because they feel like giving. Sometimes they need to be framed a little bit to act the way we'd like them to act. Palu or Tamsin, do you have something to comment upon?
I was just going to say, I mean, I'm very interested in this conversation. I don't have a particular insight, and I think, comes very much from those people really working out. I mean, I kind of feel that, going forward in the UK with all of the talk of DFID, FCO merging, I mean, I'm very interested in that side, and particularly from Gavin's perspective, how this is going to change in terms of whether it's politicization or whether it's just moving a little bit away from development into the kind of diplomacy areas, and just also moving much more into trade.
And the thought that I've been having for a while now actually is that we also need to, and it touches on something that Gavin said about we still don't have enough data in terms of understanding who are the most marginalized, who are the most vulnerable, how is COVID impacting on reshaping categories of vulnerability even. So I suppose, I mean, I'm bound to say it's a social anthropologist, but I think we really need to, as social scientists, make sure that there is recognition of the value of the data that we collect, because obviously we need science to drive treatment and to drive vaccination, but we also need the social science to work alongside in order to deliver safely those treatments and the vaccination programs, but also to understand who might need them first and how to reach them. And I think to do that in a COVID environment requires us as social scientists to think much more innovatively and creatively about how we collect that data, because obviously we can't field face-to-face surveys, we can't field any kind of qualitative search. So we need to think about how we can get that information in a way that's safe, but is still rigorous. And that's something that I'm working on at the moment in the context actually of modern slavery. And I know, Leila, obviously you're involved in that as well. So it's really pushing us to think differently. And I think that's a good thing. But I think as social scientists, and I know there's a number on this as participants of this webinar, we really need to make sure that we argue our case for why we need to be included in the research that gets funded.
course. Any additional comment or questions? No, doesn't seem. Well, because we are coming to a close, really, I would like to thank everyone for fascinating discussion. I'm sure it's just a start, and we'll have many opportunities to further this discussion together in Delhi, in Nairobi, in London, everywhere. I could see that we have colleagues who were here who are from Latin America as well. I saw former students of mine, Sebastian from Ecuador. So hopefully we'll soon meet pretty soon, and we certainly cherish our field work as soon as we can do it. In any case, thanks very much again to all our participants and speakers, in particular Gavin, Jennifer, Tamsin and Palu for joining us. We have these webinars every Wednesdays at the university now. So next week we're going to have our theme professor, Professor Gordon Blum, on health and well-being, and in particular public health policies. So this is going to be quite interesting. So feel free to join us. Thank you so much again, everyone, and in particular, lots of thanks to the speakers.
Thank you, Leila, for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you to all. Very good discussion.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.